What did I miss? Brian here, and it's morning, and it's sunny and bright outside. We've got another engine mod for the 4Runner. As you can see, the hood is up. As part of this 100,000 mile maintenance, tune-ups, and mods, I'm going to be adding an oil cooler. This oil cooler is made specifically for the 2nd gen 4x4 Tacomas, both the early models and the refresh models. So the 4th gen 4x4 4Runner V6 as well as the FJ Cruisers, they don't have them. It's only the 2nd gen 4x4 Tacomas that have them, and obviously the 2-wheel drive models don't have them. But since they all share the same exact engine, this will work on all of them. Not only am I adding an oil cooler, but I'm also going to be changing out the water inlet housing, because with the cooler, it has a set of hoses that route from the housing to the cooler, and then from the cooler to the water pump. And that is what this is on top. As you can see, there are extra water inlets on the top and the bottom, whereas on my 4Runner, it's flat. Now I'm gonna go ahead and grab both of these and move off to the side. As you can tell, there's a lot more stuff laid out. Obviously, we know what those two parts are, but we're also gonna have to install this fitting. We're gonna have to take out the old one and install this one, because this holds the oil cooler in, and at the top right there, that's where the oil filter screws in. There is also the thermostat, 2 hoses, hose clamps, and 2 O-rings. I got everything from a website called source1autoparts.com. Everything came as a set. It's all Toyota OEM parts, which is pretty nice. It costed $350 and free shipping. Now, out of curiosity, I called a Toyota dealership nearby and asked for a quote, and they wanted $900 for this cooler, and only this cooler. I would have had to get everything else separately and would have had to spend over $1,000. So going through Source 1 Auto Parts was definitely the way to go. As I'm adding all this, I'm going to be doing some maintenance as well. I'm going to be doing a coolant flush, and I'm using Toyota Lexus Super Long Life coolant, and this is the pink stuff. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be draining the coolant from the radiator as well as from the block and from the coolant reservoir tank. And I'm going to remove the intake, the throttle body and throttle body spacer, the hoses, the water inlet housing, the oil filter, and then we're going to add everything together. For the tools, I'm going to be using a socket wrench, a 10mm socket, a 30mm socket, a 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter, a T60 Torx bit socket, a couple of extensions, and pliers. As for the rest of the stuff I need, I'm going to be using coolant, a 5/16 hose, a spill-proof funnel, a drain pan, and a couple of gallon jugs. And they could either be milk jugs, juice jugs, or water jugs. But that's where all of the old coolant is going to be in. A few things to mention. One, if you're going to be doing this, you want to make sure that the engine is cold. You don't want to work on a hot engine, because if you were to open the radiator cap while it's hot, the coolant is going to shoot out, and it's going to cause a big mess, and you could risk burning yourself. Second, I'm going to be removing the battery. Now, it's not necessary, especially for this procedure, but I figure I create more space to work under the hood, and also I get a better angle for the camera. And lastly, I'm going to be doing an oil change. You do not have to do an oil change to install the oil cooler. You could just easily pull off the oil filter, install the cooler, and put the filter back on. However, I'm actually due for an oil change, so I'm going to go ahead and knock that out. Alright, I changed the oil, and I'm holding off on adding the oil filter, but I went ahead and covered this area. Next, I'm going to be draining the coolant. Now, there are 3 points of the engine where I can drain the coolant. One of them being under the radiator. Right there is a draining point on the radiator. It's on the driver's side, and I routed the hose down to the drain pan. Another drain point is on the driver's side of the engine. Not too sure how well this will show on the GoPro, but I'm holding the hose right now. This side is a little difficult to access because we got all of these hoses and all this junk in the way. But if you look behind the wheel, you'll see there's the gallon jug, and that is the same hose where the coolant will be draining out from. And the third draining point is on the passenger side of the engine. And as you can see, there's that hose. This side's a little bit easier to work around. And if you go behind the front passenger wheel, you could see there's the other gallon jug and that same hose. Oh, hi. Nice mask. So Christian showed up. Unfortunately, Adam could not show up because he actually has something important to take care of, so it's just you and me today. Next, I'm going to remove the coolant reservoir and dump the rest of the coolant out. Alright, I got the reservoir out and I dumped the rest of the coolant out. I'm gonna hold it off to the side. So next comes the part where I disconnect the intake as well as the MAF sensor, disconnect the throttle body and unbolt it, disconnect the hoses and basically everything else down here so that I could reach the water inlet housing. Alright, I got the hoses off except for the hoses that go to the throttle body. Now comes the part where I take out the water inlet housing, and the best way to know how many bolts are holding it in is to look at the new part. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts holding it in. Alright, so I have the original water inlet housing and the new one side by side, and as you can see, the parts are almost identical. So I take the bolt and place it on the same exact spot on the new part. Next, I'm going to take the new thermostat housing and place it in the water inlet housing, and I'm just gonna take the bolts from the old one and transfer it to this one. And all that is left to do is to transfer the hoses from the original water inlet housing and transfer it to the new one. Now before adding in the new water inlet housing as well as the thermostat, we need to change out these two O-rings, one on this tube and one on the water pump. And these are the two O-rings that came in the kit. This one will go onto that tube and this will go onto that water pump. Now, I was thinking while I changed the water inlet housing, I was going to change the water pump as well. However, these water pumps do last for a while, so I'm going to hold on to this one, but keep a close eye and a close ear to make sure that there are no leaks and that it doesn't make any funny noises. Now, to add in the new water inlet housing. Now to reconnect all the hoses as well as the hose clamps. Moving over to where the oil filter mounts, now I'm going to remove this fitting, and this is where the T60 Torx bit comes in. Okay. Now to add the oil cooler, and if you look closely, there's this little nub on where it sits, and there are these little tabs. That little nub sits in between there. We take the fitting, and it comes with a metal gasket. Sits in between the cooler and the fitting. Screw it in there. All right, you can see it's sitting there, and this is where the 30mm socket comes in. Then I take the 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter, place it in there, and then we screw it in. All right, there we go. With the cooler in, now comes the part where we add the hoses. Now, to determine which hose goes where, the flow of the coolant will go from here to the top part of the cooler. It goes around, and then it comes out of this side of the cooler, goes down towards the water pump. And these hoses are bent specifically to route the coolant that way, so it's pretty difficult to mix it up. And if you take a look closely, these are the hose clamps that came with the kit, and they have these locks on there that hold the hose clamp open. I'm gonna grab the pliers and then pull it up. And it's that simple. Oops. There we go. And now to add the bottom hose, and as you can see, this will go from the cooler down to the water inlet housing and then into the water pump. Okay, we got all the hoses hooked up. This is connected to right there, and that is connected to, well, hard to see, but down there. Now all that is left to do is to put the intake back and put the throttle body back and reconnect the sensor. And I may just ditch the throttle body spacer because I'm bored of it at this point, and it's putting a lot of stress on the tubing of the intake. So I'm gonna keep it off from now on. Next, I got the oil filter, and this is also Toyota OEM. Then got the battery. There we go. Last thing we need to do now is add the coolant. Oh wow, this is very bright pink. All right, that's almost 2 gallons. I'm gonna stop there for now and start the engine. I'm in the driver's seat, and as you can see, there is that funnel still full of coolant. I'm gonna go ahead and start the engine. I'm also going to turn up the heater core all the way up and on full blast too. Then we want to check to make sure that more coolant goes in, and so far it seems like it could be full. And also we're going to check to make sure there are no coolant leaks either. So far it doesn't look like there are any. And I'm going to let this run for a little bit just to make sure that everything is cooling smoothly and that the temperature doesn't spike up to hot. So it seems like I bled all the air out. I'm gonna go check in the driver's seat to make sure it's not overheating. And looking inside, no, not overheating. It's extremely hot though. I'm gonna turn this off. And looking on the dashboard, there's the door opening light and the seatbelt light, but there is no check engine light, which is pretty good. So by the looks of it, it seems like there's no more air. However, does anything sound off to you at all?
No.
No? Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the engine. And I'm gonna take a last look at the temperature gauge. And it's still in the middle, so that means there is no more air and the system is full of coolant. So it's been 2 weeks since I installed this oil cooler kit, and yes, 2 weeks. I usually do a test within 1 week and update after that, but in this case, I did 2 weeks and I will explain why. I'm very happy about this installation. It works and my mind is more at ease knowing that the engine oil is getting cooled down. However, I don't have a temperature gauge in the cluster, or I don't have a temperature gauge period to know the temperature of the oil and how much it dropped. So I'm pretty bummed about that. I really wish I had one, but it is what it is. If you take a look at my power steering cooler as well as my transmission cooler, you'll see that these coolers are air cooled, meaning that the fluid goes through and air passes through the middle to, well, cool it down. However, with the oil cooler, this is water cooled, meaning that the water or the coolant will go through the hoses and go into this sandwich type cooler to cool down the engine oil. For this installation, you don't have to do an oil change. The most you have to do is just pull off the oil filter and pull off the fitting, add the sandwich cooler in and add the new fitting, and then put the oil filter back on. In my case, I was due for an oil change, so it was the right thing to do. And also, you don't have to drain the coolant completely. The most you have to do is just drain the radiator, and when you pull off this water inlet housing, a little more coolant will come out. But that's really all you have to do. You don't have to drain the block. I chose to do that because, well, I hit 100K miles, and one of the maintenance requirements at 100K is a coolant flush. So I drained the coolant completely, and now I have fresh coolant going throughout the entire engine as well as through the oil cooler, and I got a new thermostat. So it was the right thing to do. And to top it off, when I drained the coolant, it came out clean, it wasn't faded, and it wasn't brown in any way. So that means the cooling system is still in great condition. However, the coolant came out red, which is not good because this 4Runner is supposed to come with super long life coolant, which is pink. And since it came out red, that tells me somewhere before 100,000 miles, this 4Runner had a coolant flush and it was filled with the wrong stuff. So definitely flushing out the coolant before adding the oil cooler and then adding the right stuff was definitely the way to go. Going into the performance, well, my truck doesn't feel like it's going any faster, but does it feel anything different? No. My engine doesn't feel like it's running any smoother or rough, really. So mainly the oil is just getting cooled down and then just recirculating through the engine. Maybe in some way it's making it run smoother, but I'm not noticing it. Now, the reason why it took me 2 weeks to make an update is because, well, halfway into the first week, there was a little bit of oil leaking from the oil filter, and a little bit of coolant was leaking from one of the hoses that leads to the throttle body. Here's a better angle. Now, when I installed this oil cooler as well as this oil filter, it was bare metal and pretty clean down here. However, 3 to 4 days in, oil started forming right here and was slowly dripping down the oil cooler and then started hitting this cup. So it wasn't spewing out oil, it was just very, very little. I wasn't sure why. I checked to make sure that this oil filter was fully on there, and it was. So I cleaned it and waited another few days, and oil stopped leaking ever since. As for the hose that leads to the throttle body, you could see there's a little bit of pink between the water inlet housing and the hose. It was actually a little bit worse than this. There was more pink forming towards the front, right where that white mark is, and I did a horrible job at cleaning it up. That's why you see there's still some pink left over. But I cleaned it up and I drove it around some more, and it has not been leaking ever since. I was afraid when I saw that because I thought I was losing coolant and I thought I was going to have overheating issues. So I checked all the other hoses, I checked the radiator, and I checked the block. And luckily, there are no coolant leaks. These oil coolers were originally for the 2nd gen 4x4 Tacomas, and it was only for them. It was meant for people that like to tow things or go overlanding or off-roading. Regardless of what you drive, whether if it's a 2-wheel drive or a 4-wheel drive, I would highly recommend getting one of these oil coolers. My 4Runner is a 2-wheel drive and I cannot tow with it, but I have no regrets on getting this oil cooler. It's better to have one than to not have one, and for the price of $350 for the whole kit, you definitely cannot beat that, whereas the dealership sells this cooler alone for almost $1,000 and everything else is separate. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you're subscribed, thanks. If you're not, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Take care, everyone. I'll catch you on the flip side.